All right, those of you that have been to some of these before, this is number 7 out of 8. Know I say some of the same things at the beginning of each one. One is, this is the one about my 8 years at the seminary, 2002 to 2010. For me, that was age 52 to age 60. And there's way more that I can't say than I can say, for 2 reasons. One is there's not enough time. Number 2 is there's a lot of things that are just better left unsaid. So I'll leave those. You can read the book someday and you'll see those things. Number 2, I realized as I was doing this that there's really no one person that knows me well from each of these 8 chapters of my life. As I thought about it, it's probably true for all of us. Different people know you better from different chapters of life. And then for those of you that are here for the first time, which there's a few of you, you know, my initial idea on this was not to be here in church giving talks, was just to do this in my living room and have like 10, 15 people come over, and I had it viewed more as like fireside chats. Maybe even having a drink in hand and just chatting about these things. But people said you should have it in a little larger space than your living room because maybe more people would want to come. So that's what I've been doing. But that's why I don't really even consider them formally talks. That's why I called it purposely Musings. Musings means I can pretty much say whatever I want to say, whether it fits together or not. So we'll see. And even though they're not a formal talk, we'll say the Lord's Prayer to begin. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. So, those of you that are here for the first time, these usually have been going about 45 minutes. As I look at my notes, I realize I have enough notes to talk a couple hours, but I won't do that. As if we're near 45 minutes, I'll try to cut her down. But anyway, I was invited, or you could say appointed, to go to the seminary as the rector in the spring of 2002. If those of you who went to the last session know that chapter of my life, I was working in the various jobs with the Archbishop in the Chancery office. And the way I loved working with Cardinal Regali, and the way that worked was one day I was just sitting in my office, minding my own business, and he never knocked. When he wanted to come into your office, he just walked in, and there was a chair right next to my desk, and he sat down. All I knew was whenever he came in my office, by the time he left, I was going to have more to do than before he came in. So this was true in this case. And he asked me to be the rector of the seminary, and I was a little surprised, and because anybody who knew me from my own seminary years would have been surprised that I was asked to be the rector. And I was also a little disappointed because I was enjoying doing what I was doing. So to a degree, I resisted, but he said, well, take a few days to think about it. But like everything else in my priesthood, he said, I'll give you 3 days. So Friday, I told him I would accept. I mentioned in almost every talk that there's really no insult to any place I've served, but there's really nowhere that I've been that I would have chosen. I just have gone where I've been asked to go and made the best of it. A couple of places I didn't even know where they were. In this case, I did know where the seminary was. I had gone to a college, a seminary college in that building. But I found over my priesthood there was a certain freedom in obedience, just like a good soldier, just go where you're sent and do your best. And then there's a pattern that was true for me that I tried to talk to the seminarians about. There's an old saying about is any man worthy to be a priest? The answer is no. I used to have to publicly stand up and say yes, they were worthy, but it's all kind of a qualified worthy. The real answer is no. No one's qualified to be a priest. But the saying that we use for seminarians is, he doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. And so I thought the same thing would be true for me as the rector. To those of you, most of you look like you were probably alive in 2002. So you're, just to remind you what was going on in the country at that time and society, President Bush had just gotten elected in the year 2000, and that was the hanging Chad election. Then he was the president for the next 8 years. 9/11 had happened just the year before, so things were changing in the country that way. There was the Gulf War. In the church, the trend that had started the previous decades continued. There were fewer priests, fewer religious, fewer vocations. The Catholic subculture, which we had when I was a child, meaning that almost everybody went to church, hardly anybody ever got divorced, mostly nuns and brothers teaching in the schools. That continued to fade throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and by 2002, we were at a whole new place with the loss of that Catholic subculture. The Vincentians, Congregation of the Mission, had been serving the seminary for 177 years. Our first bishop of St. Louis was a Vincentian priest, Bishop Rosati. That's the seminary system started in 1818, and by the middle of the 1990s, they pretty much ran out of priests to staff the seminary. So the first diocesan priest to be the rector was Father George Lucas, who served starting in 1994, and he served for 4.5 years till he became the bishop in Springfield, Illinois. Then the next was another diocesan priest, Msgr. Dennis Delaney, and then me. So we were at that time in 2002, we were 24 years into the papacy of Pope St. John Paul II. So you call that some stability, 24 years to Pope. But by that time, his health was declining. There was more stability than there was in rapidly changing times in the 70s and 80s, because in the 90s, the church came up with the Catechism of the Catholic Church. But then by 2002, it seemed likely that Pope wasn't going to live much longer. He did live a few more years after that, but it was changing times. Also, the summer that I was appointed in 2002, that was the year that the abuse scandal broke for the clergy. So, welcome to the seminary. And that was a very difficult time for the church. A couple of vocation directors from around the Midwest had been arrested. Some priests had been arrested. Some bishops had gotten themselves in troubles with issues. Eventually, they posted a list of all the offending priests in the St. Louis Review years later. There ended up being 64 priests on that list. And so I knew most of them. Most of them were around my time, within, say, the 20-year period before I was ordained and around that time. So it was a very difficult time. And so it's like I say, welcome to the seminary. I walked into that situation and everybody was asking the question, well, what's wrong with the seminaries that they're putting out these kind of priests? And not only what's wrong with them in the past, what's wrong with them now? So that was the situation I walked into. So it was a lot of challenges associated with that, and with all those priests being accused of inappropriate things, there was a lot of blaming going on, and which never really helps anything, but it's a situation that I walked into. I felt like we were under a microscope. We were under a microscope. But the approach that I took with anybody who came up to me with anything was, I'm not talking about what happened in the past. I'm only looking forward. They use the term, it's time for a purification of the church. So I thought, well, as a rector, I had a chance to be part of that purification. Bishop Regali was used to using the phrase, the seminary is the heart of the archdiocese. So it was my job to try to make the heart of the archdiocese heart healthy, and to do what I could. I will have to say, I did ask around about people who I thought would have helpful information for me about what happened in the 80s and 90s and the 25 years before I got there. And that was helpful for me to help figure out a direction that we should move in. And in the end, I While I was leaving behind certain things, I was leaving behind being pastor of a parish. I was leaving behind teaching at SLU in the graduate school, which I love doing. And in my younger day, I also used to go around giving a lot of talks and retreats. Well, going to the seminary, those days were over. Two really pleasant things happened that summer in the midst of accepting that position in those changing times. One was I already had a sailing trip planned, so I was really glad I did that. Because you think, well, maybe he would just skip that and just jump right into being seminary rector. Nope, I chose to go ahead and go, and once I started, I was really glad I went on that sailing trip. Also, that was the summer that there was a World Youth Day. It was a World Youth Day in Toronto, and some of the seminarians, I think 10 or 12 of them, rode bicycles to go to Toronto for World Youth Day. And so I was 52 at the time, which is pretty old to the seminarians, but I asked them if they would mind if I would ride along for part of the ride. I think they were surprised I asked. I said yes, I did. I rode along. I just went one day. I rode along the shore of Lake Erie, and it was an 8-mile ride. I had one of my friends drop me off there, 80 miles outside of Cleveland. Rode the bike. I picked that spot because it was one of the nicer rides. Some of them were just pretty much out through open fields, but Lake Erie's the northwestern corner of Ohio is pretty scenic. So I did that with the seminarians, I think much to their surprise. So when I went to the seminary, I would say it was a collaborative effort. We always said the purpose of the seminary was both to help seminarians discern whether they had a calling or not, and then to help form them into being good priests. It was a collaborative effort between the teachers who were professors, the students who were seminarians, the administrators who were myself and my assistants, and the staff, including people who cleaned and people who cooked and did all those kind of things. It was a pretty complex operation, pretty tiny. Only about, I think the most seminarians we ever had when I was there was 120. So compared to a parish I have now with 15,000 people, it's a pretty tiny operation, but a pretty complicated one. Everybody had their hand in the pot. And so that involved the seminary board, the bishops, vocation directors, the priest of the archdiocese, all seem to be experts in knowing how to run the seminary, the alums, the benefactors, and then the faithful of the archdiocese. The faithful, they don't call you guys the faithful for nothing. You are faithful. People kept showing up to church in the midst of all these challenges over the times, and you deserve to be called the faithful because your trust is not in the priest or the human side of the church, but your trust is in God. But the faithful also were not without opinions. There were the various agencies in the diocese, the finance office, the pro-life office, the annual Catholic appeal, the education office, the priest council, the deacons. They all had advice for me on how to run the seminary. That was kind of part of what my responsibilities were, was to listen. And it's fair enough, because everybody that I mentioned was a stakeholder in how the seminarians turned out. Another challenge that I had was that there were 5 different bishops in charge of the diocese during the 8 years I was there. Cardinal Regali appointed me there, but shortly thereafter he got moved to Philadelphia. In the interim, there was Bishop Naumann in charge, and then Cardinal Burke was appointed. When he was appointed, shortly after that, Archbishop Naumann went to Kansas City, and then Cardinal Burke was there a few years, and then he left, and he was moved over to Rome, and then Bishop Herman was in charge for a while, and then until Archbishop Carlson got here, and then he was in charge. So, as you know from reading the news, not all bishops approach everything the same way. But it was my job to steer the ship in one direction, regardless of what the different emphases of the different bishops were. And not only that, but the faculty they had their favorites among the different bishops. And so they would try to encourage me faculty has a lot of authority in the seminary. Because of the accreditation process, they need to sign off on a lot of important things. And so managing all those opinions, and these are all very highly educated people, very articulate and well-spoken people who all really loved the church and cared about the church. So it was my job to listen to all of them, but ultimately to listen to the Archbishop because he was the chairman of the board. So I was only the president rector. So he helped set the tone, and each one of those 5 treated me like gold, which was great. I think they were all glad that they weren't the seminary rector. And so, and I was glad to have that responsibility. It's a honor to be asked to have that position, and I was going to do my best to make it work out in all those changing times. I called a couple of my friends when I was asked to take that position, and 2 of my very close friends happened to be former rectors. It was Archbishop Lucas, who's just recently retired from Omaha, but he and I were in the seminary together. He had been the rector there before me, and so I said, well, why do you think the bishop asked me to go there? He said, I don't really know, but he said, why don't you just trust the bishop? He must have had a good reason. So I did. And then the other one, who's in the news a lot, you all know the name, is Cardinal Dolan. He also was in the seminary with us, and he had been a rector over in Rome at the Pontifical North American College. So I also spoke with him, and it was nice for me, better than nice. It was a big bonus for me to have 2 very close friends who had been rectors, so that when I could call them and ask for their opinion about different things, I would get their opinions, and they wouldn't necessarily even know the people I was talking about, but they would understand the situation. So they're both dear friends to this day, and they also served as mentors to me. So that was in short, what I was getting at was, in a certain sense, a whole lot of people consider themselves experts in running the seminary, but I was one who had the responsibility. Usually people would ask me, they say, oh, are you the one in charge of the seminary? My standard answer was, I hope not, I hope God is. But at the same time, I had the earthly responsibility. And as I had one of my friends who's a developer and builds all kinds of buildings and projects, I had him come in and tour the school one day because I knew from the day that I got there that we needed a capital campaign. The building needed more than a facelift. It was built in 1929, so by the time that I got there, it was over 70 years old. And me being over 70 years old, I know that anything over 70 needs a lot of maintenance. And so that was, the building certainly did. I knew we didn't have money. When I got there, they were still cutting things on my budget and on the staff, but I knew that eventually it would take place. I just needed to take my time and have a plan to come up with that. But my one friend who came in and just toured it, and I said, give me some ideas. What do you think we could or should do here someday? He said, well, you got quite a challenge. He said, you have 3 institutions in one. He said, you have a hotel, you have a school, and you have a house of formation. And that's 3 pretty different things, but all under one roof. So anyway, I think that was a nice objective. He didn't really know anything about seminary work. He just knew about buildings. And I think he gave me a pretty accurate description as to what my responsibilities were there. So here was one of my challenges in being the rector. I had to challenge the men to be better than me. I was supposed to be a good example, but I could not be a barometer. So I would find myself asking them to do things sometimes that I hadn't done. I'm guessing most parents go through the same thing, hoping their kids turn out better than they did. And that was kind of my wish too for this. I certainly didn't hold myself up as a measuring stick, but ultimately it was my responsibility in the end to either recommend them to be a priest or not. And I had a lot of opinions to help me to shape that. You ever heard the saying, 2 things you don't want to, that can be good, but you don't want to see how they're made? One of them is sausage, the other one is laws. Well, the seminary is kind of the same thing. You don't really want to see the process from the inside as to all that happens there. It's pretty messy because, again, for the reason I said, a lot of people who really care about the seminary and love it and love the church and love Jesus Christ, they really care about what's going on there. So it's legitimate that they all have opinions. But in the end, that was my role to kind of sort all that out. It was a very human place in that regard. Spiritual also, kind of like the church in general. They say it's both a human and a divine institution. So the seminary had those same components. From an organizational perspective, you could say there were stakeholder groups, especially when you got to the end of the process. Who had a say on whether the men advanced in holy orders or not? People would approach it from a psychological perspective, from an academic perspective, from a pastor's perspective. And in the end, part of our process was the rector was required to have the faculty vote. The rector wasn't bound to make a decision based on how the faculty voted, but it wasn't often I was going to make a different decision if they all voted a certain way. They didn't always agree, but for the most part, that was not a huge issue, because I felt like most of the men who weren't meant to be priests withdrew on their own. It was pretty rare that we had to ask somebody to leave. There's a couple of the priests that are here that were students when I was there, and they're very familiar with they call them the 4 pillars of formation: human, intellectual, spiritual, and pastoral. It kind of relates to 4 parts of everybody's life. You got to pay attention to your body, your mind, your soul, and your key relationships. It's kind of the same thing, it just applied to this, but they came up with a fancy name for that. They called it, they came up with a document called the PPF, Program of Priestly Formation. And it was good. It had good guidelines in there. And then one of the many things the seminarians teased me about was I was forever using the word integrate. Because the people out in the pews could care less if you learned something academically or spiritually or pastorally. They could care less what class you learned it in. The idea was you had to bring it together in one person, and that's what the people were interested in. And I also used to remind the professors that in all my years being a priest, which I was a priest 35 years before I got there, for 35 years before I got there, 27 years before I got there, 35 by the time I left. And so I would remind them that in all my years as a priest, no one who ever approached me with a personal problem asked me my class rank or grade point average. Not that it wasn't important, but it's not the most important thing at the seminary, which you can imagine professors were not always excited about that attitude towards priestly formation. But it's what I stood up for. So that was my job, to try to help the men grow in all those different areas and to integrate it into who they were as a human being. And I would have to say, paying that close of attention, I needed to get to know those men really well, or at least as well as they would allow us to get to know them. A phrase that some of the seminarians used and some of the staff used was, some of the men flew under the radar, which is too bad. They lacked integrity and not good for them or not good for the church. But that happens in every aspect of life, and so the seminarians are all human, and so is the rector, so it worked out that way. I remember the first day I walked in there, one of the things I told them was, I'm not quite sure why the bishop sent me here, but I can tell you one thing, he didn't send me here to make you happy. That's not my goal. My goal, and as I said, frankly, this seminary isn't about you. It's about the church. And so it was my role to help provide that kind of focus to the church, to everything that we did there. There's a pretty fancy word that's used to describe what the seminarians are called to be, alter Christus. It means to be another Christ. Well, that's an impossible thing to achieve. The phrases that's used to describe the alter Christus, being Christ to the people, he is to be both the head and the shepherd. Well, some of the men had a problem because they were more excited about being a head than being a shepherd. and that was my job to try to remind them that their role was to go out and serve the people, not just tell the people what to do in a holier-than-thou kind of way. You see, the subtitle I gave to this talk was Amazing Grace, because, I mean, who doesn't believe in amazing grace? The scriptures say God's grace can do more than we ever ask for or imagine. True. But at a real fundamental level, here's just something that I thought a lot about and prayed a lot about. Like, say, this year there was, I don't really know what the number is, but let's just say it's 30 men applied to the seminary, well, from all over the country. So why was it 30 and not 3 and not 300? I don't know. And out of, say, those 30 men who go, why are 20 or 25 of them ordained and some are not? I don't know. And of those who get ordained, how come a certain percentage stay in for their whole life and a certain number of them drop out? I don't know. So that's why I called it Amazing Grace. I knew about Amazing Grace before I got to the seminary, but I learned about it it was very graphic at the seminary. It was very visible. That St. Paul talked a lot about that when he said, one of his summary phrases was, I live no longer I, but Christ lives in me. So yeah, so it was a good reminder to myself that I needed to work as hard as I could to make that place work, to listen to all these opinions and steer the ship in one direction and make the best directions that we could about the men, ways to support them and affirm them and ways to challenge them, ways to either promote them or help them see they weren't meant to be there. But in the end, it wasn't up to me. It was up to me to give it my best effort, but it wasn't up to me as far as how it turned out. I remember that's how I ended the last talk. Certainly my years at the Chancery helped convince me about that. I said, God, this is not my church, it's your church, so take care of it. I'm going to do my best to not get in the way and to try to help out. One of the phrases that was used a lot in the seminary was God willing. Like for instance, here we have one of the parishioners from here, the first one being ordained in 40 years, is scheduled to be ordained May the 24th. But I was generally pretty careful to say, that's Michael Loggeman, I'm pretty careful to say, not that Michael Loggeman is getting ordained that day, but Michael will be ordained, God willing. It's a very, in a way, it's kind of a catchphrase, it's kind of a pious platitude, but it's very real. Because unless God's grace is there, we wouldn't have had our last breath or our last heartbeat, right? So how much more true is that about whether a man ends up being a priest or not, or whether he ends up being a wonderful priest or a self-centered priest? It's about God's grace and his reaction to it. So, as I've said several times here, because you can see this was a big part of my reflections, I call it musings. My musings on seminary life is all the opinions that were involved. As just like we all have a physical heart, so we care about our heart. If we care about our health in general, but if something goes wrong with the heart, that's especially a big deal. So that's why if something went wrong with the seminary, it was an especially big deal. And pretty clearly, some things hadn't gone right in seminaries, or they wouldn't have had all these problems come out in the end. So it felt like, now that was back, this goes back over 20 years ago, right? 23 years ago when I went there. So that was before cell phone. There were pretty primitive kind of cell phones out, and there was some email going around, actually a fair amount, but nothing like today where we were just inundated with electronic communication. And so there was still a lot of phone calls. And I don't want to exaggerate, but it felt like about once a week I got a call from somebody, and and usually the people were polite. A lot of times I knew who they were, people from around the diocese or around the country who had an interest in our seminary, because we had men from, 15 or 20 different dioceses. And here would be how the sentence would begin. Monsignor, if you care about the seminary, and if you care about priests, and then they were going to give me their idea about what I needed to do. And some of them were calling because we didn't put enough emphasis on preaching. Some of them would call because we didn't put enough emphasis on how they could raise money. Some called because we didn't teach enough about how they could be good administrators. Some called and complained because we didn't teach enough Latin. Some called and complained because we didn't teach enough psychology. Some said, why do some of the priests come out and are not that strong on pro-life? Some said, half the Catholics in the country are going to be Spanish speakers. Why don't you teach more Spanish there? Some said, some of the priests they don't really pray very much. They're just too much into socializing and being popular. So you need more time in prayer. Some said you need to teach them more about natural family planning. Some said you need to teach them more about all the racial unrest in the country and what they're going to do to solve that. Some called in and said you need to teach them to have greater care for the poor, because so many really not many poor people come to Catholic churches, frankly. So what are we doing? We're kind of a church full of very comfortable people. So it's like, wow. And so I would listen politely, and everybody who called was very sincere, and they had a rationale for calling. And I took it in a positive way, that they cared about the church, that they loved Jesus Christ, loved the church, loved the seminary. I don't know if they necessarily loved me, but they had an interest in how the men came out. And so depending upon their attitude, usually I would just listen and say, I'll think about that. And or in some cases I would explain what we were doing, but I knew if that was their first sentence, Monsignor, if you care about the seminary, no matter what I told them we were already doing wasn't enough. That's why they were calling. They had evidence by knowing some priests who weren't going to be good at whatever they were calling me about. And so, but there were some people, if they kind of kept going on and on, my answer usually was, you know what, we can keep adding more things. And we can check off the box that we've covered them, but there's only so much time in the day. So I said, if you're saying that what you're calling me about is more important than what we're already doing, tell me, what do you want me to cut out of the curriculum? Do you want me to cut out about teaching about the epistles of St. Paul? Do you want me to cut out the part about teaching about sexual morality? Do you want me to cut out the part about being better at being confessors? Do you want me to cut out the part about the Blessed Trinity? So I would ask them sometimes. As most of you who know me know that I can be pushed to making comebacks if I think the person so deserves it. But it was just, say my musings about the seminary is I loved it there actually. I loved mainly the interaction with the men. Juggling all these different stakeholder groups took lots of energy. Luckily the seminarians didn't have to deal with that very much. They had opinions about it themselves, of course, which they didn't mind sharing with me, but they weren't really they mostly were wonderful young men seeking to grow and to develop themselves. And so it was my job to sort of shield them from all these opinions. They knew they were out there too. They just didn't have to listen to them all the way that I did, and to provide a program which could give them a chance to grow. One thing that I did bring to the seminary, there weren't many other people on the staff who had been pastors. And I had been a pastor for 17 years before I got there, in addition to the other jobs I had with the Archdiocese. So I could help. I used to tell the men, if you want to talk to somebody who's an expert in church history or psychology or scriptures or morality, go talk to one of the professors. I said, if you want to talk to somebody who knows something about what's going on in parishes, I'm happy to talk to you about it. So I treated the seminary like a small parish, small but complicated parish. It had more PhDs per square inch than the average parish does, and more influences shaping it. But it was like a small but complex parish. I learned there, one of the more popular sayings of Pope St. John Paul II was that the key issues of our age are not theological. Those of you who know me well know I do not use the words liberal or conservative with regard to the church. I don't think they belong, even though I know many people did when I was young and still do. I think they're awful terms with regard to the church. Jesus didn't use them. They're not in the Bible. They're not really in most of the official church writings. But I get it. People were very divided over what they call liberal or conservative theology. Just like people compare wrongly the different popes. They use those same terms. But the key issues anyway, what Pope St. John Paul II said, and he was brilliant, of course, he wrote more books than most people actually ever will read. And he said the key issues of our age are not theological, they're anthropological and philosophical. What he meant by that was, you know, you can sit there and debate different kinds of theology, and it does matter. Certain things are more well stated than others when it comes to theology. But that isn't the questions most people are asking in their heart. Questions people are asking in their heart is there such thing as truth? It's pretty common in America to think, no, there's no such thing as objective truth. There's your truth and my truth. What's the purpose of life? Obviously there's pretty widely differing opinions on what's the purpose of life. Is there eternal life or not? What should a marriage be? What's the definition of a man? What's the definition of a woman? What's more fundamental in society, the individual or the community? Those are the anthropological and philosophical questions that are really the ones that are on people's hearts. That's where most of you are living your lives. What do you want out of life? What does it mean to be happy? So those questions are not exactly theological. Theology can help give good answers to those questions, but they're really, unless you understand the roots of those more fundamental questions, and it was my job to help the seminarians see that. Frankly, most of them did. That's why a philosophy degree is required before you start studying theology. But for some of them, all philosophy was something to check off the box that you passed the courses. But it was very important that they understood that that's what it was about, because that gets at what's really, when people call me and say, can they meet with me, and they have some personal issue, it's not often about theology. But it is very often about the meaning of life, the meaning of happiness, the way the world's going, the purpose of life, the ultimate, what's our ultimate destiny? Is there eternal life or not? Those are the kind of things that people think about. So in the midst of that, I would say the truth matters. Two popular sayings at the seminary were, you have to always speak the truth, but you must speak it with love. And another popular saying, the correlation to that was, you can't have truth without love being included, and you can't have love without it being true. So it's certainly, and it's easy enough to say those things. It's a challenge to actually live it. It's a challenge to live that in our personal lives. Because how often do we end up just doing what we actually feel like doing, based on some gut level thing, not really based on very deep thinking? We're human. That's what human beings do. Act on impulse. So it's one other problem in what I described as the seminary being like a tiny parish is gossip. Just like gossip's a problem it's a problem in every aspect of society, but it's more noticeable in smaller groups. It's noticeable in families, when people pick on one another in families. Word gets around in a hurry, and somebody shares something about somebody else. And it was a big problem in the seminary, and it's understandable, because it's a small group. People had opinions about one another. They had opinions about me. They had opinions about the staff, and many were not slow to share those opinions. And so that was my job, was to help try to build a sense of prudence, because if a man's not prudent when he's a seminarian, probably not going to be prudent when he's a priest. And the priest is supposed to be a listener and an information gatherer, but not an information disperser when it comes about other people. And it takes practice. And the seminarians, again, I would say, given the benefit of the doubt, out of love for the church, they really did care, but they didn't always express it in the most prudent of ways, what their opinions were. A lot of things would have been better left unsaid. But it's like a small town. It's like a small town that way, where what's usually said about small towns, everybody knows everybody's business. Not really true. You know what you see on the outside, but you don't really know what's going on inside people. And kind of the same thing there. There was a lot of, because it was so small, there was a lot of things that were known, and there also were a lot of false assumptions made about one another. So a phrase that I used to try to encourage them is circumspect of speech. I said, people, your parishioners will tell you a lot more if they know that you're not going around talking anybody's opinion about anybody. It just, that people need to learn to keep things to themselves that they learn, because the priest is to be sort of a sanctuary of trust, that people can say anything to him and know that it's not going to be repeated anywhere else. There's a saying that kind of goes along now with all the, whether you call it gossip or public discourse about who the next pope's going to be. You've probably even heard this on the news. It's said so often nowadays. Those who talk don't know, and those who know don't talk. And it's true about a lot of aspects of life. So I think I'm getting near my 45-minute mark. I am at the 40-minute mark. So I'm just going to say a few closing things, quick hits on a few things. Because of that abuse scandal, one of the things that happened during my watch was all the seminaries had what was called an apostolic visit. That meant we had our regular accreditation visits, so we could be giving accredited degrees, but apostolic visit meant it was coming from Rome. So a delegation of bishops came from Rome and around the United States to sort of inspect our seminary. And particularly on these lines of what had been caused the abuse crisis. And so our seminary came off pretty good on that as far as the they did that. I was there 8 years. I'd say that was after I was there about 4, 5, 6 years after Pope Benedict was already the Pope. And so we came out pretty good in terms of what we were doing, but it was a challenge because they used the phrase a lot in the report, in the recent past, this is what happened here. And so it was important for me to keep all that in mind, and I use that information to fine-tune what we were doing there and to try to help bring things in line more with what they were looking for, Pope Benedict and the others in Rome were looking for. Second thing is, along the lines of, again, the same friend of mine who was who was a developer, and he gave me his opinion about what was going on there. He said, well, here's the challenge you have architecturally, is you're trying to run a hotel within a school. And true enough. And so we did come up with a plan for having a capital campaign to fix things up. And I think it was kind of a funny story, but it was kind of the tipping point. This was after Cardinal Burke had come, and he hadn't been here too long yet, but he was out. He loved coming to the seminary. He was there a lot. He even gave his cell phone number out to the seminarians, and he would go on walks with the seminarians. One day he was sitting in my office in the summer, and it was pretty hot, and we had power outages off and on, and he knew about that. But we were just sitting in my office, and we didn't have any central air. We had some window units, and so we're just sitting there chatting, and all of a sudden, the lights went off in my room. And I honestly didn't even notice, because I knew that they went off every time the compressor kicked on the air conditioner. And he goes, what's that? And I go, oh, I didn't even know. He said, what do you mean? He said, the lights just went off. I said, oh, well, that happens all the time. So that really was providential, because a couple of months later, he announced the beginning of our capital campaign. So the capital, I view that was a God moment. God sent him to my office at that time so he could, and the campaign was very successful. And I never viewed it as raising money. Those of you who know me well know the way I talk about that. All I was doing was selling the mission. And there weren't many people who were not excited about having a good seminary. And again, partly because of the condition of the building. It was a building looked beautiful from the outside, but it needed a whole infrastructure makeover. And so it was a pretty easy process to sell the mission. The same people who were wounded by the church and what some of the priests did still loved the church and wanted to help support it. And so that was a blessing the way that went. So now part of my perspective on the seminary is that there's we've been blessed from our parish to have a good number of seminarians. We haven't had anybody ordained yet in my years here, but we're getting close. But we've had a good number of men there. So every now and again, I'll just go there and have lunch with them at the seminary. And so some of the people now, the seminary staff, in fact, I think almost half of them were students when I was there. And so one of them, I'm not going to say his name. You notice I don't mention many names in doing this. That's the best. We'll have one of them who was a former student. He walked by the table where I was one day eating lunch with our seminarians, and he saw me smiling when he walked by. He said, "I know what you're smiling about." I said, "What is that?" He said, "You're looking at all of us who are in charge now and wondering, where are the adults?" I said, "Yes, that is exactly it." But that kind of fits into the Amazing Grace theme, you know. I would imagine that there were people who, when I was appointed rector, thought the same thing. Where are the adults now? But yet God's grace has a way of pulling it all through. So at the end, I could end pretty much every talk the same way and just say it's God's church. And the prayer, it's a prayer. Before I go back to my house tonight, I go by that Mary statue in front of my house, in front of the chapel, and there's 3 prayers that I say, and the act of contrition, and the last one is the Salve Regina, and then in between I say the prayer. The Latin name is Suscipe. Take, Lord, receive my liberty, my understanding, my entire will, all that I have and all that I possess. You have given all to me, to you I return it. Give me only your love and your grace. That is enough for me. So that's a beautiful prayer, and that's what I learned from the seminary. It was my role to try to pull all these diverse opinions together and to steer the ship in one direction and help the men, in a way, help protect them from all the variety of opinions that were out there, and to make it easy for them to grow. So every time I do hear of one of these, to me they're all young priests, and the oldest of them now is well in his 50s. Actually, the oldest of them is well into his 60s. That was a student when I was there. And so whenever I hear any good news about any of them, I take a little pride, at least knowing that I had the sense to recommend that man for holy orders, and I had some role in informing him. So thank you for your attention tonight. Is it? Either of my fact checkers, you guys want to say anything? Both of those. Some of you know Father Foy. Father Foy served here for a while at our parish. So yeah, welcome him back. I have a lot to be proud of in those years. I just did that position the same as I did all the other things I was asked to do. Did it the best I could and said, God, it's your church, so you help take care of it. So we'll go in the back. Anybody who wants to visit can do that for a little bit. Does somebody else have any questions or anything you want to rebut, anything? All right, I'll just go back here then. Brett? You'd have been a heck of a seminarian, I'll tell you that. Go ahead.